And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and we are continuing on at this time with our series, which is entitled The Biblical Narrative as Holomovement. And what we're saying in this series is that there are two stories or narratives about God, from God, that are about the nature of our relationship with God. Now, initially, as I've started out here, and as we begin where you would start with any story or narrative in the beginning, these stories seem very obvious as you begin. And we're talking about the process of informing and forms and formation and the universe and biblical cosmology. Many of these things seem very obvious. As we go along, however, we're going to find out that the 2,000-year-old story or narrative of Christology that has been handed down since the Roman Empire does not align with God's other story. And these are both God's stories. So we're showing how the Holomovement aligns with the biblical narrative so that we can validate both. The problem right now is that Christianity is a closed system. So people that are in Christianity right now that hold different interpretations of the same story have argued for centuries. And this is what has led to thousands of denominations. People disagree because there's nothing that, in essence, can be a third party witness. And what we're proposing is that the Holomovement is also the story of God, just like the biblical narrative is the story of God, and that the Holomovement is an outside witness validating and testifying as to the validity of what we're saying about Christology. We've shown that when you first start out in both our universe and in biblical cosmology, that there are two orders. There's an explicate order and an implicate order. There is a source related to information. In the beginning was logos, word, information. This indicates consciousness, the presence of consciousness, to communicate via word and to inform is a conscious effort. And we started last week by showing that the very creative act of God was one of informing. And God said, "Let there be light." And from there on, God speaks all the way through the narrative to different people in the narrative, each of them playing a role and function in this God informing process. The explicate order of our universe then comes from a process or movement. This is holomovement. One of the holomovement elements is informing. Informing is a creative action. It is action, it is movement. Thus, the holomovement. Informing is movement. Informing leads to formation or forms. That's how the information is concretized. So you have movement leading to formation in both the biblical narrative, as we'll get to here momentarily, as well as our universe. And there won't be a lot of controversy about that. But again, I want to take each chapter of the story. So you begin with what? Chapter 1. Then we'll go to the next chapter and the next. Each chapter building on the previous chapter. And that way we get a real good look at the types of interpretation that should be applied to the things that are coming up down the line in the story. So it's David Bohm, the quantum physicist, who came up with this idea that our universe is made up of forms or things. And so I love that term form. Those of you who have followed presence over the decades know that I've had a trajectory that has shown that the story begins in form and it concludes by delivering humanity into a realm of formlessness. Those are the chapters that are a little bit later down the line in the story, and we're going to get to those chapters. So, a consciousness of form is what begins the biblical narrative. In other words, yes, the biblical narrative does talk about our universe. It does talk about the sun, moon, and stars. It does, again, verify it's the same source telling the same story that ends up with a result of forms. The forms of our universe are explicate forms, and it will be the appearance of the human that brings about something unique into the universe with regard to form. But if we start at the beginning, and I will get to these other things in a moment, the very first part of the narrative tells us that the earth was void and without form. Well, that was not the end of the narrative. It was telling us there's something lacking about the planet Earth, that the earth needed form. So, how does God then finish the creative act of informing? It is via separating. He separates the animals of the ocean, the animals of the earth, the animals of the air, and he provides form. Form allows for the navigation in an organized manner versus chaos. But with the human, now the human appears. At the end of this form, it's been things, forms. We finally get to the story of Adam and Eve, and now we have biological form. Okay, just like we have external forms of planets and stars and galaxies, now we have an external form called a biological form. But the human being is unique in that the human being is said to be God-breathed, and that word, as we have shown, is ruach, and that relates to spirit. There is then this unique consciousness within the human being that allows form to go from the external to the internal, where we as human beings can now contemplate form and forms from a consciousness standpoint. And that's how Adam and Eve start, and the entire biblical narrative will be focused on the evolution of human consciousness with relation to form. And we'll develop that now for a few minutes. We'll talk about that for a few minutes. These forms that are internal forms, what would they be? Well, they'd be like perspectives. My view of this, my view of that. Worldviews are forms that define how we see and interpret the content and meaning of what we encounter. They're all forms. And these forms are absolutely necessary to define the boundaries of the meaning that we assign to things. And it's necessary to have forms in order to tell one thing from another thing. The meaning of the information, because this is the process of the Holomovement and the biblical narrative, both stories, it starts with an informing or information beginning? Well, information requires interpretation. And this is where we run into the human being who is subject to a variety of interpretations. Now, because form defines this explicate order, we know that it plays a role and function of things. Each thing in the universe has a role and function. That belongs to form, role and function. But as we showed in our last episode, when you talk about source, which the biblical narrative calls God, you're talking about identity. So, what do we need to know then about form? Let's talk about it in just some of its basic aspects and elements. First of all, form is boundary based. You do have to be able to differentiate this thing from that thing. So it requires a boundary. And the boundaries of form require the adjudication of law. In other words, you must have laws that define what a form is and what a form is not. When you look at our universe, for example, you look at the stars, the galaxies, our planet, etc., etc. All of our universe is subject to law. We need the law of gravity. There's the law of relativity, laws of thermodynamics, etc., etc. The law is that which applies to the explicate order. The same is going to be true at the beginning of the biblical narrative, and the explicate order of forms that we're going to discuss now, and the fact that law is absolutely necessary as the story begins. So, when you look at quantum physics, the explicate order of the universe requires law, but when you move into the implicate order, it transcends law. You don't have these laws of gravity, relativity, etc. Those are manifestations. The law is a manifestation of source, but source itself is not subject to law. It's an interesting thought. We're going to develop that some more. As the story begins in consciousness, remember you have internal forms. What were the internal forms that law was used to determine? Well, one of the basics was obedient, disobedient. Each of those were forms because within their boundaries, the law determined whether you were obedient or disobedient. However, again, the law is subject to interpretation. And so one of the weaknesses of law is that it depends on the human self as source. It depends on human beings. And as we all know, human beings disagree about the interpretation of law, even in the courtroom. When you look at internal forms, then, obedient, disobedient, and the keeping of law requires doing. So in the explicate realm of form, in the biblical cosmology, it is up to the person to do the necessary thing in order to be obedient. And if the necessary thing is not done according to the law, then that person is defined as disobedient. As we move along in the story, then, we're seeing that the law is associated with doing. However, when we go into the implicate order, which is where we find source, which is where we find God, spirit, we have moved from doing to being. God doesn't do anything to be God. That identity is innate. And the Spirit of God, which is innate by nature, is that which manifests. all of us that are here on the planet. We are children of being. Our identity is not determined by doing. Doing only shows the degree to which we are conscious of the nature of spirit or unconscious. One quick note I might throw out here with regard to self-righteousness in Philippians 3, Paul said, not having a righteousness of my own. Paul, when he had an awakening experience, realized that law equals requirements. And under law, the requirements had to be met in order for accomplishing righteousness. Paul did not want a righteousness of his own. He did not want a righteousness that came through doing. Doing belongs to the explicate order, and that order will pass in the biblical narrative. It will come to an end. So let's continue on with this discussion. Oftentimes, and I brought this up before, the question asked of Jesus was, is it lawful? And what they're asking is, did the actions of Jesus fit the form called obedient? Now, Paul again will talk about the implicate order in terms of spirit. Spirit belongs to the implicate order. It's not something you see with a telescope, can't find it in a microscope, not measurable, observable. So what does he say about spirit? He says the spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness. He goes on to say, against such, there is no law. It's innate. Law's not involved in the nature of spirit. That's the same spirit that gave us our essence. God breathed, ruach, God spirited the human being, made the human being a spirit being. So God as source operates in that realm of being, not from doing. Now let's talk about external forms that are produced by internal thinking. The external forms of biblical cosmology, and again, we've talked about this in previous podcasts many, many times. Two of the biggies with regard to forms in the beginning of the narrative are the forms of empire and institution. Empire relates to kingdom. And here we'll find the Davidic kingdom. And so the Davidic kingdom was one that was made up of tribes, people, the land, and each tribe had boundaries around their land. And the kingdom of Israel, the Davidic kingdom, was a geographical, external, boundary-driven kingdom. With regard to institution was related to religion. One of the central symbols of form at the beginning of the story is temple. The temple was a form whose walls determined the very presence of God, and specifically the Holy of Holies within that temple was said to be the dwelling place of God, and the people of Israel could not enter into that space without penalty of death. So that geographical space, that external space, is associated with that. And you had a priesthood involved in external atonement processes. So the priesthood was involved with what? Animal sacrifices. Animal sacrifices are external to the human being, the sacrifice of an animal. And so the priesthood centered around this external form, this sacrificial system of animals, etc. A knowledge of then sin and death was produced, meaning that people were separated from God based on what they did, and there was none righteous, no, not one. Everyone was found guilty under the law. And so that produced an endless loop whereby the people had to yearly go back to the temple for the Day of Atonement. And this loop was endless. Every year they had to go back for this atonement because sin and death could not be defeated by one's keeping of the law. Therefore, you have terms in the biblical narrative like bondage. In the first cosmology, one was in bondage to sin and death. Now, when we go to physics, the other thing that we need to be aware of is that there are two basic forms that our universe is subject to. Those forms are time and space. Time and space. Again, speed of light determines how much time something takes. And then it also defines how much space there is between planets or solar systems or galaxies. Time and space are absolutely the two forms that undergird our external universe. In biblical cosmology, time was also one of the forms that determined how that cosmology operated. So again, I go back to the atonement. It was once a year, same time, and sacrifices were performed for forgiveness of sin. But with regard to time, it was subject to time because it was yearly. There was no end to it, so it was subject to time. Now, when we get over to the priestly work of Jesus, we're going to see that it was once, one time, not an endless loop. And for all, for everyone, for all people, it was once and for all. And so, therefore, it transcended, it put an end to the restriction of time. This is more reflective of the implicate order, which transcends time and space, as has been shown in the world of quantum physics, so also in biblical cosmology. Space was important in terms of temple, etc., because it was saying and illustrating that God is separated from the people. God was separated, the presence of God in the Holy of Holies, etc., etc. When we get over into, again, the work of Christology, it will begin with the individual Jesus of Nazareth, who will present a radical idea. The Father and I are one. This is what has happened in the field of science, and specifically in quantum physics, because what was shown was that there is an implicate order beyond time and space, and yet it is interconnected and one with the external universe, whose foundational principles require time and space. They seem to be two completely different spaces, and yet they're interrelated and interconnected. And that's why the movement between those two is called a holomovement, because holo means W-H-O-L, whole, in that sense. And that is the story of the biblical narrative, the story of one and oneness, and all things being one. So this is the way it began with Adam. Adam in the story, the metaphorical story of Adam and Eve, they began void and without form, just like the planet Earth. What do I mean by that? They began void and without form. Well, they were given a commandment or law. It wasn't until law was given, a commandment was given, that their eyes were opened. In other words, for form to be understood required law, just like our explicate universe requires law for the operation of form within it. The command or law then opened the eyes of Adam. Adam became aware of the forms, the elemental forms of obedient, disobedient. That was the eye-opening experience. Form, with regard to obedient, disobedient, was what was defining Adam's relationship or lack of relationship with Source, which is to say, God. Adam is then separated, just as God separated to begin the process of planet Earth. So also Adam is separated from that garden. His awareness of separation from God begins a necessary journey. This is not a fall. This is the beginning of awakening of the human journey to the role and function of form. And it will be shown as the human moves along a natural propensity to attach to those forms, to attach to the temple, to attach to biological genealogy as identity. All of these things were forms that the human initially understood to be God identity. But the journey was showing that this experience of form, temple, priesthood, animal sacrifices, the genealogical identity, the geographical identity, all of these things were but the beginning of this story. And so we can see then how these things are correlating, if you will, with the universe itself beginning in the realm of form. When you move on into the apostolic writings, which we're on our way there as we continue these chapters, there's a statement by Paul in his writing to the people of Galatia. And here's what he said: "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." Here is something dramatic happening with form. This, what Paul just outlined, is totally with regard to form. When the fullness of time had come, time is a form. As we said, there are two elemental forms that undergird the external universe, time and space. Both of those are necessary for us to have a universe. Well, what is the fullness of time? When the fullness of time had come, what is Paul thinking? He's thinking when the fullness of form had run its course, when the people of Israel had dealt with keeping form, had dealt with the attempt to stay in the form obedient, had dealt with all of their form attachments, had suffered when they lost their temple in the Babylonian captivity, had been exiled from their geographical form, which is to say their land. All of these things were showing them that God relationship and that the abundant life was not going to happen through form and form attachment and the doing of the human that came with that. So when the fullness of time had come, the fullness of form had served its purpose in the story. It played a necessary role and function. But when that happened, God sends forth his son. This is the role and function of Jesus of Nazareth. And where does Jesus begin his journey? Born of a woman, biological form, born under the law, the internal form, the adjudication of the boundaries of internal form. Jesus begins his journey. But Jesus is going to show there's something that transcends our biological form. There's something that transcends law, just as the implicate order does in our own physical universe. So that's where we're going. There's two narratives here. One is the Holomovement, which is the narrative, God's narrative, of how this universe operates. That's God's story about came from God. God is the source of this universe. That's a God story. It has certain elements that we've already gone over. What I've just started with is that these very same elements show up in biblical cosmology. And that also is a God story. Now, the initial chapters about form, usually I don't find too much disagreement from folks on that. However, when we begin to move to the role and function of Christology, that is where we get into the various disagreements that have led to literally thousands of denominated, separated forms, all under the umbrella of that which is called Christianity. So I had to set the stage, as I've done here. The Holomovement will show us that the enfolding process is a process by which there is movement from form back into formlessness. And how does that happen? How do you get from form to formlessness? Through transformation is part of the creative act of God. The Holomovement is the creative act of God in our physical universe, and Christology is going to be the creative act of God in our biblical cosmology. And we will see it for what it is in terms of its role and function, and for what it is not. So that's where I think I'm going to leave it today, going through form. I appreciate questions and different things that you all have reached out to me about, and talked to me, sent to me, etc., etc. So keep doing that. I appreciate your input, appreciate your feedback. Next time we will continue on with our story, and as we move along, it gets a lot more interesting. So I will see you at that time.